because people are afraid to grab or touch the levers and buttons in the control room of the historical vehicle. And what that means then is that people who can cut through these many, many illusions, the illusion of materialism, the illusion of business as usual, the illusion of benevolent institutions carefully guiding us toward reasonable destinies. If you cut through all that, if you disabuse yourself of all that, you will empower yourself to eventually be able to stand up in delicate social and political situations and just say, bullshit. That's bullshit. And this is worth considering doing.
The enemy that will really subvert the enterprise of building a world based on clarity is the belief that we cannot point out the pernicious forms of idiocy that flourish in our own community. And this problem is growing worse all the time. We have tolerated too many loose heads in our community. We are not willing to take on the karma involved in argument and discourse that actually gores somebody's ox. We consider this politically incorrect. I can feel the tension in this room because people sense I might gore their particular ox. We have perfected politeness. We have perfected the ability to listen to damn foolishness without betraying by so much as the flick of an eyebrow that we realize what we're in the presence of. Now I think it's time to refine our mathematical skills, learn to think straight, and not be afraid to denounce the pernicious forms of foolishness which are vitiating the energies of our community and making us appear marginal and absurd in the discourse about truly transforming society.
And so the lone critic standing up against the tide of history can make a difference.
That's something that everybody can do. It doesn't cost any money, doesn't take that much time, but it requires a certain amount of courage to sort of upset the apple cart and sort of come out. But I think that's something that's really important. And then people can become educated more.
I'd like to just add one little bit to my bio there. Essentially, I feel I'm a drug-using, countercultural criminal who is trying to go legit.
Here's a little shout out to our Native American friends. One of the problems when they first started inventing football is the Native American teams would fuck up the white teams.
Sure.
So they had these dudes were like, college educated and trying to learn how to play this new game, and these Native American dudes would put the smash down on them. The fucking old school angry that the grandpa got scalped, land got stolen.
As they should be.
Yeah, they've been hunting bison for 1,000 generations. Put that real smack
But it
down.
wasn't like they were making millions of dollars.
Arguably the best sounding, their language is like the coolest sounding language ever. It's got that, there's like a sound to it. Like there's something to their accent. Millions and millions of members of different tribes living in this country, like basically like Stone Age people, just 150 years ago.
You could make the case that we already know by looking at these tribes in the Amazon that are as if living cavemen without much contact.
Mm-hmm.
And we try more and more now just to let them alone. But
you go there, they're wearing Nikes.
Yes.
You go there, these dudes have fucking Kobe Bryant t-shirts on. They have like Mickey Mouse hats. I mean, it's weird. You see these people in the jungle and they have all this Western clothing. You're like, wow, it's so weird. But yet they're living like an indigenous tribe.
Not that it was like this perfect paradise before we got here.
Definitely wasn't. Yeah, that's an interesting perspective that some people grab onto. that the Native American people were completely at peace with each other. They definitely weren't. But they fought amongst each other so much. And
that was their sport in a way.
Yeah.
I mean, and they had that as killing. It was a way of becoming, trained as a predator.
This idea of Native Americans being like
the peaceable.
Yeah, horseshit. 100% horseshit. That's not how they lived. The white men were fucked. The Comanches would just dominate them because they could shoot arrow after arrow, and they were just a ferocious people. They didn't no artwork, no beadwork. They just made teepees. Like
beadwork.
Really, they weren't. They didn't have like illustrious like works of art.
And
the Redskins.
And
is that an offensive word? Like
that's an offensive word.
Me even saying that, like right there, is that offensive?
Yes.
Genetically, they go into groupthink really, really fast. And so Native Americans, you can mind control really fast.
Oh, she's so nuts. Like, because Trump was always calling her Pocahontas, and Trump said that if she... What cultural appropriation is like, say if these Native Americans had a specific style of clothing that if you wore it, you were a shaman and you were a sacred person, or you had a headdress that you wore during very intense spiritual ceremonies, and someone just started wearing that for fun. Someone thought it was cool to wear that for fun. Well, then it becomes offensive, and that's cultural appropriation because these people have this ritual, this very important sacred ritual, and this one part of that ritual you are defacing, you're mocking it openly, and it's offensive to them. It hurts them. You want to hear an Aztec death whistle?
Sure.
I think if someone has something that's sacred, like a headdress or something that they specifically wear, and then you walk around and wear it, that's kind of a dick move, right? Whatever.
Let's just pretend, for the sake of argument, that the fairy tale version of Thanksgiving is true, and that these chud balloons actually do care about the holiday's message of being compassionate and charitable to all people. Simply giving thanks or celebrating a day to spread goodwill is meaningless until you start changing your behavior and exploring the actual truths behind these holidays. The holiday doesn't matter if you don't practice what it represents. So what has America actually done to give thanks and spread goodwill to Native American communities? There's a mentality that we shouldn't focus on the past, that teaching young warmbos about all the horrible stuff America has done won't serve any constructive purpose, but to make them ashamed of their country. That the best thing for the country is to just move forward and not backward, and just forget the unpleasantness of our ancestors. But we're not moving forward by pretending these truths don't exist. You can't move forward by ignoring the past and erasing the reality of what was done to America's indigenous population. That's moving backward. And when has a policy of ignorance ever been beneficial in the long run? This isn't an ignorance is bliss situation. This is the ignorance of pretending there isn't a gremlin on the wing of your airplane and continuing your course over the Atlantic Ocean, blazing past every point of no return on the strength of sheer hubris.
These tribes in the Amazon that are as if living cavemen.
But they fought amongst each other so much.
And that was their sport in a way.
Yeah.
I mean, and they had that as killing. It was a way of becoming, trained as a predator. Not that it was like this perfect paradise before we got here.
Definitely wasn't.
Gee, that doesn't seem like it fits the morals of Thanksgiving, does it? Not really getting a sense of unity and fellowship here, are we, guys?
Their language is like the coolest sounding language ever. It's got that, there's like a sound to it, like, there's something to their accent that just, I guess it's like we're programmed to think of Native Americans as like spiritual and authentic.
Because America, in general, loves to habitually fetishize Native Americans in popular culture and pretend that we're honoring them. They're not worried about the harm being done by perpetuating this ignorance. When has ignoring a wound been the best policy?
Research shows that racism is pretty strongly connected to just about every mental health condition that we've examined. So we know this is harmful, and it is actually I would say it's definitely a major public health concern. How do these things operate? Well, they operate through what we call false or pathological stereotypes. These are ideas about people of color that don't necessarily correspond with reality. All of these things contribute to what we call cultural trauma. And so these more subtle kinds of racism, often people say they're unintended, but the consequences are the same for those of us who are targets or victims or who are oppressed by it. And bad intent is almost always denied by perpetrators, even the ones in this category. So conscious intent is not necessary to perpetrate racism. Overt feelings of hate and prejudice are not needed to perpetrate racism. And we also have something called structural racism, and this is the type of racism that is baked into all of our systems, right? Because given that almost no one admits to being a racist today, and yet racism persists. So how is this? And it's in here, it's in us, it's in our movement, unfortunately.
So that's what made me think that when I was turning 18 and was this draft resistor, and what would I devote myself to? And it felt like the most highly leveraged area was consciousness change, because it can ripple out and affect all the different projects.
Okay.
So I don't often give the big picture in a way like that,
right.
Because certainly if I were to start talking to the FDA like that,
right.
They would wonder.
Right.
And I felt that I had been inspired or given a mission by Holocaust survivors. I've had dreams of Holocaust survivors telling me to study psychedelics. But this dream was, I'd say, the most important dream of my entire life. I had a dream of a Holocaust survivor telling me that he wanted me to be a psychedelic researcher and therapist. This is the best response I can think of to genocide and the Holocaust, or to irrationality taking over. And this is in my middle 20s. So this is after I decided to focus my life on psychedelics. But I remember this dream like it was just last night. So there's a person on a deathbed. The room is all white. And the fellow tells me a story. The story is that he was miraculously saved. He almost was killed, but he was miraculously saved, and he knew he was saved for a purpose, but he didn't know what the purpose was. And then he says to me, "Let me show you how I almost died." And it turned out that the scene now, all of a sudden, we're out of this all-white room, and now we're off at the edge of town, outside a town in Poland, and it's been captured by the Nazis, and they've got these thousands of Jews lined up in this big open grave, and they machine gun them. They're pushed into this mass grave. They throw some dirt over it, and this guy is wounded but not killed. And then it sort of switched a little bit into like a Jesus story, where he was buried for 3 days, and then he was resurrected and climbed through bodies to the surface. And I'm with him in the dirt underground, seeing this whole thing. And he runs into the woods. He works with the partisans till the end of the war. So now we're back in the all-white room. He's on his deathbed, and he said, "Now I know what my purpose was. I know why I was saved from that." And I'm like, "Oh, what did you learn?" He said, "My purpose is to tell you to study psychedelics." And that's going to be the sense of mystical connection, is going to be the antidote to genocide. So I always felt that I had the Holocaust survivors behind me saying, "Don't give up." I mean, the fact that it was hard didn't matter. It's like, what else would I do? I think by 2050, the goal is to have a more spiritualized humanity. And, we're talking so much about climate change, and people are talking about net zero carbon. What we need is a world of net zero trauma. And I think if we can really globalize access to psychedelic healing, destigmatize it, and globalize this post-prohibition world, by 2050, in a little bit less than another 35 years, we should have a net zero trauma world. And that's, and also we do need a big shift from fundamentalism to mysticism. So we've got people killing each other over different kind of religious ideas. You can't force anybody to have these experiences but hopefully if we have enough of a cultural context where people have had psychedelic mystical experiences, psychedelic unitive experiences, that we will see kind of a move from fundamentalism, which is literalism, to sort of symbolic, metaphorical mysticism. So hopefully that's where we'll be at by 2050.
Fingers crossed.
The country of Bhutan has developed a national index of happiness, and many people have heard about this. So what MAPS we're talking about now is to develop a national index of trauma. And we just had a meeting with some people at the UN and how we might actually do this. And then the goal is a world of net zero trauma by 2070. So now that it seems like we're maybe 2 years away or less than 2 years away from FDA approval of MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD, it seems likely.
So what are you most excited about now going forward as we close the podcast? Now, what are the things that you're seeing on the horizon, or what is the vision you have for the future that you're most excited about?
Well, when I talk about a world of net zero trauma by 2070, what that really means is that we have to go into refugee camps and migrants. We have to go into prisons. We have to work with prisoners and prison guards. We have to go into countries that have, like Rwanda, where there's been, genocide.
Our long-term goal is mass mental health, a spiritualized humanity. We really need to think in a globalized way. And trying to bring psychedelics back to where we can sort of spiritualize the population in a way and reduce trauma as we face incredible challenges that humanity has never faced before. Only a spiritualized humanity will help us get out of these problems that we're in.
A spiritualized humanity. Yeah, that's really the end goal for MAPS. Mass mental health equals spiritualized humanity.
And that means helping people have these experiences with peer support on their own outside of medicine or religion in order to embed this kind of spiritual connection in the billions of people.
This idea of a spiritualized humanity. So that is really our goal, is mass mental health and a spiritualized humanity. You could say that humanity is now like lemmings going over the cliff. And how do we stop that? We need more people to wake up.
I think by 2070, to be really in a long-term perspective, I think we will either have a spiritualized humanity or we will have destroyed ourselves. Wow. And you can see all these people that are above 0.6, 9 out of around 33 had a full mystical experience with MDMA. But what we've shown is that there is no correlation between healing from PTSD symptoms and the mystical experience. And that's a really important distinction.
And the MDMA doesn't change brains in a bad way. It changes brains in a good way. Opens up channels of love and things like that. When I tell people about MDMA who've never done it, I say it's more gentle than cannabis. It's easier because it doesn't do the ego dissolving, and it's not the same way as LSD or psilocybin.
MDMA is more gentle, is more heart opening. So MDMA is the gentlest of all the psychedelic drugs.
MDMA is the most gentle of all the psychedelics. It's the most inherently therapeutic of all the psychedelics.
But MDMA is the most gentle of all the psychedelics. It's easier to integrate. It doesn't produce the panic reactions that other psychedelics tend to do. MDMA being the most gentle of all the psychedelics, the easiest to integrate. MDMA is the most gentle of all the psychedelics. MDMA, it's the most gentle of all the psychedelics.
If you were to design a drug for post-traumatic stress disorder, MDMA would be it.
MDMA is ideal for treating PTSD. It's almost perfectly designed for the treatment of trauma or for the reduction of anxiety.
So I do think that for PTSD, that MDMA is the ideal drug. And we were able to have a drug, MDMA, that's ideal for PTSD. So all of that is what I knew beforehand, and that's why I started MAPS.
So at age 18, I thought,
well, because I was thinking I was going to go to jail too, because of being a draft resistor. My parents were supportive, but they said, you're never going to be able to be a doctor or a lawyer or anything like that because you'll be a felon. And so I thought, okay, I'm just going to have to figure out something else I can do with my life. And then when I first started doing LSD in 1972, in 71, I realized I could be an underground psychedelic therapist, and that doesn't require a license. So that became my career goal. I'm not willing to go to Vietnam in order to get a certain kinds of job. And then I thought, I can be an underground psychedelic therapist. You don't need a license for that. So that quote has been fundamentally important to me in my early on strategy. And at that time, I identified as, counterculture, drug-using criminal, because not just because of the drug law, but also because I was thinking to go to jail. So when I was 18, 1972, 50 years ago, that's when I thought I need my own psychedelic psychotherapy. I want to become a psychedelic therapist. I can do that as an underground thing. I don't need a license.
So anyway, all of that led me to think, I could be an underground psychedelic therapist. I don't need a license for that. And so so all of this is to say, I don't think of myself as a saint. That this is what I want to do. And I thought, because I'm going to be arrested any soon for being a draft resistor, and I'll have this felony and stuff, that I can be an underground psychedelic therapist. You're not going to need a license for that. That'll be my career. So that's how at age 18 in 1972, all this came about. I decided to become a psychedelic therapist. So at age 18, I decided to be an underground psychedelic therapist because you wouldn't need a license.
I believe this is the first ever therapy session that you did with a PTSD patient. Can you tell this story, please?
Yeah. Let me say that it was the first ever therapy session that I ever did with anybody. The first time I ever dealt with a patient was in 1984.
And also in 1984, I did the first work ever with a PTSD patient, my first work ever.
Now, also in 1984, I worked with my first PTSD patient.
Yeah.
I think in 1984 is when I worked with the first PTSD patient with MDMA.
It was actually in 1984 that I, for the first time, worked with a woman who had PTSD. And I was learning to be a therapist before I veered off into the politics. Well, let me just say that in 1984 was the first time that I actually worked with a PTSD patient. I did work with a PTSD patient in 84.
I received the treatment a year before I was criminalized. So in 1984, I was 23 years old.
So, but it was 1984 that I worked with a PTSD patient who was on the edge of suicide. And I didn't feel qualified, but this woman had no other options. She'd explored traditional psychiatry. She'd been in a mental institution. They'd given her the same drugs she'd been given before. She had attempted suicide in the past. But I'm not qualified to work with somebody that's at the razor's edge of death and life. That's so much worried about committing suicide. She'd had this balance, but the MDMA upset this balance. It came to the surface, and it was so painful for her that she checked herself into a hospital to avoid self-harm. And she was there 4 or 5 days, and then she got out with the same pills and the same stuff that she knew had never worked before. And so she was even more in despair. So the MDMA session turned out to be a tour of all of her lifetime history of traumas.
I've heard it many times when people say like, oh, I want to become MDMA therapist, and I worry about people practicing outside their competency because they think, oh, the medicine will carry the session. And I've seen the harm caused by that many times. I've had a lot of referrals into my own private practice where people had a really traumatic experience on a psychedelic because their sitter, somebody who was sitting for them, could not hold that space, and it just created more harm.
PTSD. Martin Luther King actually said a great thing. He said the person that thinks the law is unjust and violates it and is willing to suffer the consequences as an example to others about the unjust nature of the law actually has the highest respect for the law. He was trying to reframe civil disobedience as patriotism. And it made sense to me. And so when I talked to my parents about it, they were like, well, okay, we don't think you should go to Vietnam either. We don't think it's in America's best interest. But you're never going to be a doctor or lawyer. My dad was a doctor, because you'll be a felon. And I'm like, that's a price I'll have to pay. What am I going to do with my life? I can't have a normal job, in a way. So then when I stumbled on psychedelics, I was like, great, I could be an underground psychedelic therapist that doesn't need a license.
Whatever happened? Did you wind up getting in trouble?
No, it's astonishing. I think a lot of times we overestimate the efficiency of the government. And so nothing happened at all.
You should be able to buy MDMA for $10 or something like that. And you should be able to use it if you have PTSD, if you want to try to heal yourself, or if you want your friends to sit with you.
Sure.
We would promote that.
It's called treatment manual. That explains how our therapeutic approach is done, and you can practice it on your own with your friends, sitting for you, or you can sit for your friends.
So many of us, we do not have a therapeutic alliance. We don't even have therapists. We have our friends that we like to trip with.
Right.
Can we create this therapeutic alliance with friends?
Yes, totally.
Loads of people are telling us now they've read our treatment manual that describes our therapy on the website, and they've gone and found MDMA on their own, and they've done it with friends, and now they feel better. So we're not trying to say it's always got to be done in these supervised ways, that people can heal themselves a lot, and sort of the democratization of psychedelic psychotherapy.
For now, people sometimes seek out treatment outside mainstream medicine among a network of underground psychedelic therapists. Some of that even goes on at Burning Man. Rick spent much of his last few days there counseling a veteran suffering from PTSD. Rick could tell the man needed help.
It was somebody that seemed on the verge of massive mental breakdown, was in a massive mental breakdown when we met, crying and talking about how there was no point, nothing else had worked, PTSD for decades. It was just such a powerful appeal for help.
Along with the counseling, Rick treated the vet with MDMA. This wasn't the full treatment that MAPS is undertaking in its phase 3 trials. The phase 3 treatments are hours of therapy with 3 MDMA sessions 1 month apart. But Rick gave the vet a flavor of it.
It started a process that I think provided hope. To see someone start in a puddle of tears and feeling like all the options had been exhausted and there was no reason to live anymore, to having hope and interest in other therapy sessions was profoundly inspiring.
Rick says the vet is doing better and looking into getting more therapy.
And I have done some therapy sitting for people over the years, but not much.
The other was working as a therapist, so that I would occasionally, sit for people in difficult straits.
This is a long time ago, but I've worked with people several days before they died with MDMA. When they were dying of cancer, they were on heavy opiates. They're basically tranquilized. You're not hardly present at all. And the opiates don't remove all the pain, and it's a terrible situation. When you add MDMA on top of it, now these were very risky, initially risky situations because nobody knew the drug-drug interactions. You're taking a cocktail, 10 different drugs.
Right.
And what is MDMA going to do? But these people were dying anyway. We all decided to take the risk. But these people were dying anyway. We all decided to take the risk. But these people were dying anyway. We all decided to take the risk. But these people were dying anyway. We all decided to take the risk.
I was actually thinking now of an experiment that we could do in the Ukraine. Maybe we can test 100 or 2 people, refugees from Ukraine and Poland or elsewhere, with one MDMA session, and then track a control group of the same amount of money over the next couple of years and see if the group that got the one MDMA session doesn't have as many people progress into PTSD.
in order to make MDMA into a medicine, we work with chronic PTSD, which means PTSD for 6 months or longer. Because there's a natural resilience. A lot of people will get better, and so you'd need large numbers of subjects if you really wanted to try to give it to people right after a trauma. But in places like Ukraine or elsewhere, one of the studies that I've realized would be really good to do was maybe we could give, let's say, 400 Ukrainian refugees at some sort of stable refugee center or something. And if we can somehow or other give each of them, or half of them an MDMA experience, one MDMA experience with support, the other half get whatever is available, but not MDMA. And then we look out as of a year or 2 years or so, did a smaller percentage of the people that got one MDMA session develop into full-fledged chronic PTSD than those that got something else. The idea I'm talking about here is MDMA as a prophylactic for shortly after the trauma, to try to make it so people can at least process it there. Maybe that doesn't harden into chronic PTSD. Group therapy would be the way to go. Mm-hmm. But that we have to find other healers, other, we could say, facilitators, or who's going to lead these sessions, or who's going to manage them. There are not enough psychiatrists or psychotherapists. So, similarly in Rwanda or in Somaliland or South Africa, we don't have enough psychotherapists in the United States. There need to be other people trained to do this treatment delivery than just limiting it to therapists or psychiatrists. But sort of training local people, even the challenge of doing it in different languages. How do we supervise them? How do we, have the videotapes? Do we even get things videotaped? How do we really do the supervision? How do we get the local people who are going to be helping others to have their own MDMA experiences so that they know what it is before they give it to others? It is going to be a challenge. How do you keep track of these refugees when they're driven from their homes and who knows where they're going to go? But you want to track them, for years to come. But when you've got a situation right now where there's 4 million refugees and there's an enormous amount of trauma, maybe it is okay to have it where, on balance, most of the people are getting better, but there are some people that don't get the support that they need, and it, doesn't really help them. But doing one session in a refugee camp or something like that for a bunch of people could be a really good way to move forward. It would still be research.
The humanitarian projects are all non-monetizable. They'll cost more than it brings in, but they're a crucial part of what we're doing. So we're trying to move forward with those.
When we talk about Rwanda or South Africa, there's not psychiatrists, there's not psychotherapists. We're going to have to find new models, and these models are going to be riskier, and these people are going to be more traumatized. The whole culture is going to be traumatized. So is there going to be blowback if we do work in these humanitarian ways with countries that don't have the kind of support systems that we have with local healers, and things go wrong? Will that have implications for the FDA? My sense of it is it's a risk that we must take.
I think that we at MAPS should be, and we're having this internal discussion, that we should be less concerned about, the risks. What if somebody has a bad outcome? Or what if, we have to spend time reviewing their safety data? Again, I think we're a bit too much on the risk side of things. And
as we get more and more prominent, and as we get more and more media, that people who want to attack us can then do that in a way that generates more attention for themselves.
Right.
So that they have incentives to be as inflammatory as possible.
so the things that hurt to me, I would say, this idea of cover up, some of these criticisms, including there was a recent, statements that seem way over the top about this cover up and, suppressing and denying her experience. And so I think that didn't really happen. So it has caused people to say, we're, suppressing, denying all this stuff, which I don't think is true. Yeah. So I think as far as, the unethical sexual misconduct, we pretty much have been public about it, told everybody about it. The initial situation was more bad behavior from
a therapist and, his wife not reporting on him. The complaint that initially was received did not raise any red flags about the therapy, but it had, it had developed into a sexual situation. So then eventually the male therapist had this unethical sexual misconduct with the patient. That went on for a year or so. Nobody heard about it. The patient ended the relationship. Our training program emphasizes ethics and not having sexual relationships. The therapist had a sexual relationship with a patient. It was, again, a husband-wife team. It was a two-person team, and the husband initiated the sexual relationship after the therapy was over. One of our therapists had sex with a patient in phase 2.
A therapist had a unethical sexual contact with a patient. As far as we know, there's only one case where a therapist had a sexual relationship with a patient. So, there may be others that we're not aware of, but nobody has brought that to light.
Yeah.
So I think that we're doing pretty well.
They describe it as a sexual relationship between a trial participant and her study therapist. Like, excuse me, what? Like, we're talking about a therapeutic relationship. There is no consensual sexual relationship here.
Even though, again, this unethical sexual misconduct came sexual after the therapy was over, when the cameras were off, and after that was all done.
So the major ethical issue wasn't what happened in the moments of therapy, which one can see on it's all videotaped. The real issue was about one of the therapists getting involved sexually with the patient in subsequent period of time.
Yes, I would say that. So I would say that, we have had over 360 patients that have been treated with MDMA. As far as we know, there's only one case where a therapist had a sexual relationship with a patient. So, there may be others that we're not aware of, but nobody has brought that to light.
Yeah.
So I think that we're doing pretty well. So, there may be others that we're not aware of, but nobody has brought that to light.
Yeah.
So I think that we're doing pretty well. But
my job, I feel, is to be perpetually dissatisfied, and want more. And once I'm, happy, then that means somebody else should lead MAPS.
The MAPS staff is so good and so varied now that things were going to continue even without me.
So
it's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work,
and thank God you're the one at the helm. You're doing such wonderful things.